Miami-Dade County Chairman of AIPAC and a member of the National Executive Committee. Welcome to the Situation Room. Historians write that President Lyndon Johnson called the room every night before he went to sleep and again in the morning. George Bush Sr. called or visited every morning at 5 a.m. If the phone rang at 2 a.m., reflected Clinton National Security Advisor Tony Lake, it was either the President or the Situation Room. Either way, he wrote, my night was shot. Of course, the Situation Room is not just a room, writes author Michael Bone, a former White House director of the Situation Room. Although the mystique of the place evolves from the plush conference room, no larger than a living room at the center of the complex. The facility downstairs from the Oval Office includes a team of 3 duty officers and a communications technician, all at computer workstations, looking for crucial developments that need immediate attention regardless of the hour. The staff is on duty all day, every day, Bone writes. But the night watch gets the most action because of events in Asia and the Middle East, which seem to occur most often while Americans, including the President, are sleeping. Our guests this afternoon are uniquely positioned to talk to us about the burgeoning foreign affairs issues, situations, and potential crises that will face the next administration. Each of them has foreign affairs experience, serving as leading elected members of Congress and an appointed senior advisor to successive United States presidents. In addition to each of their impressive careers, all 3 of our honored guests are close friends to AIPAC, making themselves available to our audiences frequently and supporting the organization for more than 2 decades. John Kerry made Mel Levine, on my left here, his top Mideast advisor for his presidential campaign. A congressman and leading member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee for a decade, Mel Levine was among Israel's strongest supporters in Congress and a key leader on legislation that shaped an era in U.S.-Israeli relations. Most recently, Mel served on AIPAC's National Board of Directors for the last several years. Bill Paxon is a senior advisor at Akin Gump, one of Washington, D.C.'s most prestigious law firms. He chaired the Bush-Cheney Transition Advisory Team in 2000 and serves as a key advisor to the President's campaign. Prior to that, Mr. Paxon served in the House of Representatives for 5 terms, where he championed U.S.-Israel relations as a key member of the House leadership. In addition, he founded the House Republican Israel Caucus. Bill and his wife, Susan Molinari, who also served in Congress, led 3 congressional missions to Israel together. Bill has been a frequent guest speaker at AIPAC programs. Ambassador Dennis Ross served 3 presidents, most recently as Special Middle East Coordinator. Today he is Counselor and Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Ross is the author of a new book, The Missing Piece, a fascinating behind-the-scenes account of efforts to negotiate peace over the last decade. Please note that following this afternoon's address by Dr. Condoleezza Rice, Ambassador Ross has agreed to sign copies of his book in Meeting Room 2. A scholar and diplomat, Ambassador Ross worked closely with Secretaries James Baker, Warren Christopher, and Madeleine Albright as he toiled to bring peace to a region that sadly still knows none. Few individuals are as qualified to speak on today's topic as Ambassador Ross, and we are grateful for his participation. Gentlemen, it is a distinct honor to introduce you and to have your cumulative expertise as part of our summit discussion today. Thank you for your work over these many years and for agreeing to be with us today. Ambassador Ross, would you start us off?
Yes, thank you. And of course, it's very hard for me to agree to sign books at 2 o'clock, but of course, I'll force myself to do that. What I thought I would do is try to set a context for our discussion. This was set up in terms of the Situation Room. Well, let's look at what the next president is going to have to face, whether it's President Bush or it's Senator Kerry. Whoever is elected on November 2nd, when it comes to the broader Middle East, there are at least 3 issues, apart from the broader war on terror, that are going to confront the president. Regardless of who it is, they're going to confront the president, and the real question is how best to respond to them. First is obviously the issue of Iraq. The elections are scheduled for January. It is critical to hold the elections, but I think there's even a preceding premise that we have to establish before you look at the elections and what's going to happen within Iraq. And that is, we really cannot afford to lose. Whether you think that we had to go into Iraq because of the war on terror, or you don't think we had to go into Iraq on the war on terror, should it look like the United States was defeated within Iraq, every jihadist worldwide would take heart. Osama bin Laden wrote after Somalia that he looked at the defeat of the U.S. as it retreated from Somalia, and he said this proved that, in fact, the superpower could have defeated not only the Soviet Union that had been defeated within Afghanistan, but the United States as well. Now, that was Somalia. Imagine what happens if we are, in a sense, driven out of Iraq. Now, having said that, it's a very complicated situation, to say the least. If you look at how we're doing on security today, you cannot be reassured. The trends are not exactly comforting trends. The numbers of those involved in attacks are going up, they're not going down. The numbers of attacks themselves have increased. The sophistication of the attacks are also improving. Yesterday there was an ambush which led to the massacre of 50 National Guardsmen, and it's very clear it was a kind of inside job. People were well enough organized to be able to carry out this kind of an attack. So security is a big issue. It has to be established. We have to be able to hold the elections. The question is, will we be in a position, A, to hold the elections, B, will the political dynamic there change? Ultimately, you have to use military force, but if you don't have the Iraqis assuming responsibility, at some point you're not going to succeed. So what's the pathway we're on? What's the best way to ensure that we constantly evaluate the pathway we're on and make judgments about where we are? And what is the best way to stay the course so that the outcome is going to be an outcome that will be seen as being successful, or at least not a defeat? It might require us to redefine success in some ways, but the one thing is clear: an unmistakable retreat would be a disaster for us, not only in the region but worldwide. So that's Iraq. Then there's Iran. Iran is clearly, within a year, going to be in a position where it can create fissile material on its own without anybody's help. Now, for Israel, that will be seen as an existential threat. The imagery of mullahs with nukes is not a profound threat, it's an existential threat. It may be a profound threat for us, but it is the pathway that we're now on. The British, the French, and the Germans have been trying to negotiate with the Iranians, and it's very clear the Iranians believe that they have all the leverage, not the other way around. The IAEA passed a resolution that gave the Iranians until November 25th to come clean on their program and suspend enrichment activities, and the response to that resolution by the Iranians was to declare that they were now going to convert 37 metric tons of yellow cake into hexafluoride, which is moving you one step dramatically closer to being able to create the kind of fuel that will allow you to generate fissile material. So my prediction is that in the spring, sometime in April, whoever is president is going to receive a visit from Prime Minister Sharon. And the public headline of that visit is going to be Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and the private reality of that visit is likely to be, Mr. President, you act against the Iranian capability or we will do it. One way or the other, there is no escaping that this is something that's going to have to be dealt with in the coming year, and we'll have to look at what our choices are. The choices are not particularly attractive, but the reality of Iran having nuclear weapons is a reality that very few people want to be able to have to face. The third issue that is going to confront whoever is president is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and there is going to be the action-forcing event of Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Now, if things don't change, let me tell you what the scenario is going to be. What is unfolding right now is already a small indication of what we're likely to see. Prime Minister Sharon has made a decision to get out of Gaza. As many of you in this audience know, the debate within the Knesset on this is underway today. There'll be a vote by tomorrow night. I'm fairly confident he will win the vote, but it's a very tough struggle because half of the members of his own party who are members in the Knesset, meaning half the Knesset members who are Likud, are either against him or will abstain. So he will depend upon the Labor Party. The decision to get out of Gaza has energized Palestinian reformers because they realize when Israel is out of Gaza, you don't have Israel to blame. You have to assume responsibility. You have to govern yourself. You have to be responsible for yourself. You have a challenge and an opportunity. If you succeed in showing that there can be a rule of law and you have the rudiments of statehood there, then you have a model that can be applied not only to Gaza but to the West Bank for the world and the Israelis to see. But if you don't succeed in that, if you can't get your act together, if you can't end the reality of independent militias with their own arms, their own aims, and with the impunity to attack Israelis, which means you don't have the basis for a state, then the whole world will also see that the Palestinian cause is very unlikely to be one that can be translated into something more meaningful anytime soon. Now, into that mix, there's going to be, unfortunately, a problem. Arafat and Hamas want to create the impression that they forced the Israelis out of Gaza. They want to create the impression they liberated Gaza, that this wasn't an Israeli decision, but it was their violence that pushed the Israelis out. Ariel Sharon, in my judgment, will not back off, but he will not allow Israel to be humiliated as it withdraws. And what he will do is he will inflict a very withering response if there are any attacks on Israeli settlers as they're getting out, any attacks on the IDF as they're getting out. And I expect that Arafat and Hamas are going to try to keep up a drumbeat of violence because they want to create a certain impression. Now, if that happens and Sharon responds the way I believe he will, we will see something rather familiar. The international community will not give the Israelis any benefit or any credit for what they've done, even though they will have withdrawn from Gaza, taken a step that could have unfrozen the situation. But the international community will focus on what Israel has done, not its withdrawal, not the fact that the architect of the settler movement is actually dismantling settlements. They will do that, and the violence will also overwhelm the Palestinian reformers who I believe are trying to do the right thing. So if we stay where we are, if nothing is done to try to affect that situation, the Israeli withdrawal will end up creating a new confrontation line but no change in the situation. So if you're the President of the United States, you're going to have to think about what you do to try to prepare the ground in advance of that to make it more likely that something is coordinated so that the Palestinians who assume responsibility are those who believe in coexistence and that the Palestinians who benefit from the withdrawal by the Israelis are not those who believe in rejection. These three issues will confront the President as surely as the rest of the war on terror. How the President deals with these three issues will also have an effect on the environment that shapes the strategy for dealing with the war on terror. So with that, I've set the context, and even though I'm very unaccustomed to being a moderator, I am going at this point to pause, turn it over to my two colleagues here. When they've finished, I will then direct some questions to them, and if there's time, we'll direct some questions to the audience. Now, who is next in line?
I think Bill is.
I guess I am. Good job. Good job.
First of all, walking in here today feels like a homecoming. Seeing all of my dear friends from AIPAC, I want to tip my hat to you. The work you do every day is vitally important. Please continue your support of this absolutely outstanding organization. Particularly good to see friends like the Mazers and the Mitchells and Ed Levy and many who we've worked with over the years when I was in Congress and since. And I appreciate all the leadership you provide. And I also particularly appreciate the leadership of Howard Kohr, who has been a dear friend and a great, great leader of this incredibly important organization. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say up front, I'm a Republican. And I take a certain approach to the discussion here today. But I want you to know that I'm not an absolutist in terms of being a Republican when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the Middle East. I served in Congress when the current President Bush's father was in Congress, a man that I love, respected, and supported. But he was wrong in trying to impose on Israel our will. I think that President Bush, thank you. I believe very strongly that President Bush today has taken exactly the right approach. Approaching this issue and so many other issues in regard to the world from a moral perspective, saying there is right and wrong, and sometimes you have to stand with your allies and show them respect for making decisions on the ground. We were not previously on the ground in the war on terror. Israel has been and is. And I think that it's important to understand where the next Bush administration will go. It's easy to understand to look at where they've come from. I think that the way that this president has approached his relations with the government of Israel is the way it will be approached after the election. I think it will be approached from the perspective of where does Israel want to go? What is the approach that Israel's taking? How best can we stand with our ally rather than trying, as most administrations in the past have, including President Bush's father, to impose our will on this great nation who is our ally. I think it's important to understand that the president, when it comes to the issue of Israel, when it comes to votes in the United Nations, when it comes to other nations within the Middle East, he will continue to approach those issues based on what we've seen over the last 4 years, whether it's telling other Arab states that they have to deal internally with the kinds of things we've seen, their education system that is breeding terrorism, when they have to deal with the issue of financing terrorism within their own states. These are issues that this administration has put forward in an aggressive way, and I expect absolutely will be done once the election's over and the president's returned to office. Why is it important to understand where the president is coming from? Because I think that it does lead to a conclusion on where we will be going in the future. And I think one thing is most important when we talk about the Middle East, and I believe this is true. I do not think you will ever see this president, he hasn't in this administration and he won't in the next, use Israel as a bargaining chip for anything else. I do not believe that will happen. And matter of fact, when we talk about Iraq, I think it's important to understand that we will see in the next administration, regardless of who's elected, some of our so-called allies and friends in the world who will come to us and say, without a doubt, you know it and I know it, the question will be, we'll be happy to help you in Iraq. We'll be happy to help you in other fronts in the war on terror. But we're going to need some things too. And you know and I know what those things will be. It will come down to, are we going to pressure our friends in Israel? And I'm convinced that the next term of this president will not result in using Israel as a bargaining chip. Now, I do think we've made great strides, and I think it's important, again, to take a look at where we've come. Under this administration, we've seen Libya take an important step forward. The president focusing on Syria, sanctions, clearly delineating states that are not working with us versus those that are. Looking at Korea from not just a bilateral perspective any longer, saying that other countries like China, Russia, Japan have a stake, and forcing their involvement in that instance. Working very hard to bring down the structure of terrorist financing, addressing the issue of radical Islam in Islamic nations. I think these are all important issues that the president has addressed that will continue in the next administration. But again, from the perspective of, are these countries willing to step forward in the war on terror? Are they going to simply sit back and allow others to do the work for them? Dennis mentioned the pathway to success in Iraq. I want to turn to that for just a moment. The pathway to success in Iraq is resolve. It doesn't mean that there are changes that may occur in terms of strategies and tactics, but we must continue to stand forth and say Iraq is not just about a front in the war on terror, as important as that is. Iraq is also about a front in promoting a democratic Muslim state in the Middle East. We have watched very clearly over too many years now, too many decades, countries in the Middle East that continue to talk one game but walk a very different one. And I am very hopeful that as I have a 5 and 8-year-old daughters, that we look down the road to when they're young adults, that they will be able to point with pride to this moment when the United States of America, against a lot of world opinion, stood up and said, we are going to help create a democracy in the Middle East. You know, I remember Ronald Reagan and our so-called allies in Europe laughed and derided and criticized him for trying to face down the Soviet Empire. He was laughed at the time, and he was opposed at the time by many of the same countries that oppose us today in Iraq. But it was a question of a moral imperative, and the result was a safer world today in terms of the prospect of nuclear conflagration. I think the same issues are at stake today, and I think the historic perspective on this will be as important in terms of changing the dynamic in the world. When it comes to the next administration dealing with other issues, I think you're going to see the next Bush administration dealing with them, once again, from a position that we've watched over the past 4 years, Iran. I think the president laid out in his first administration an axis of evil. And again, there was a lot of folks on both coasts in this country and around the world who said, you know, that's a pejorative sense. We need to talk to these nations and not confront them. But I think it's been clearly demonstrated that we can talk and talk, and in some, for example, the last administration talked a lot to North Korea, and they went right forward in terms of producing their weaponry. We have to expand the circle and get other nations involved. And I think when it comes to Iran, we will see the administration focus very clearly, first and foremost, on our ally in the Middle East, Israel, working to build coalitions, but also stating very clearly that the idea that we're going to negotiate with a terrorist state, whether it happens to be Saddam Hussein in Iraq or a regime in Iran, is not going to be tenable. We're going to have dialogue on other issues in terms of where things will be going in the future in foreign policy matters, but I want to just close and then we'll turn over to Mel for his perspective. Just a couple of other quick points that we need to take into consideration. Regardless of who's elected president on Election Day, a week from tomorrow, A, I think we can all agree we want it to be over a week from tomorrow. B, get unanimous support for that proposition. B, I think it's important to note that regardless of what happens, there will be new players both in the administration and in Congress. President Bush has had one of the smallest turnovers of any administration in terms of cabinet and sub-cabinet positions. I think there's a lot of those folks who have served for 4 years who are waiting to have the opportunity to go back into the private sector. They've done yeoman-person service for this country. So if the president's reelected, I expect very significant, if not almost complete turnover in terms of the cabinet and major sub-cabinet positions. And certainly if Senator Kerry's elected, we'll see that too. So there's going to be a ramp-up process for either administration coming into office. It's important to note we as a nation need to deal with that. We need to make certain that no one in this world takes that as a sign of weakness when there's a new administration or the administration comes in, President Bush, for example, and there's a lot of new faces coming in. We're going to stand in terms of our resolve. Secondly, there's also going to be great changes in Congress. I happen to believe, and I think the independent pundits indicate that there's virtually no chance there'll be a change in the House in terms of majority and very, very slight in the Senate, and I think that both will stay in Republican hands. The fact is, though, that there will be changes within those bodies. Term limits that we put in place after 1994, the majorities in the House and the Senate, the Republican majorities, have term limits for committee chairs. So, for example, on the Appropriations Committee, there is going to be certainly a change. Chairman Young is term limited. There will be a new chair of that committee. A number of other committees and subcommittees, there will be changes. So we're going to have to work with those, work through those changes. And either administration is going to have to deal with Congress with a lot of new faces in place because of those kind of mandated reforms, mandated turnovers that will occur. So with that, I'll stop and we'll turn it over to Mel and hear his perspective. Mel?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill and Dennis. Let me begin in a way that's very similar to the way that Bill began by both complimenting AIPAC and thanking AIPAC for doing this. I suspect Bill would agree with my comment that during my tenure in Congress, there was no organization that was more important, more effective, more influential, more key on a range of issues. Take a look at the impact of almost any organization on any issue. AIPAC on the U.S.-Israel relationship is really singular. And I had the opportunity to hear the end of Howard Korr's remarks, and particularly his reminding people who are here of the extraordinarily vital role that each of you play. I can't tell you how accurate that is. I know Bill would agree with me from the other side of the aisle. What you do in Washington is indispensable. I'm very, very pleased that you're gathering here in Florida, and whatever side of the aisle you're on, keep up the work that you're doing in Washington. It's extraordinarily important. And on a couple of other just brief personal notes, I'm very honored to share the stage with my old friend Dennis and my former colleague Bill. When I was in the Congress, I felt Bill Paxon was one of the most effective and talented members in the Congress. As I mentioned to him briefly before we began, even though I felt that early in his career, it was reconfirmed to me when he married Susan Molinari, one of my favorite members of the House. Going back to Howard's initial remarks, Howard concluded his remarks when he was talking, I think, in extremely thoughtful and careful language about the extraordinary difficulty that will face whomever the new president turns out to be on some of the most important foreign policy challenges this nation has faced and will face in the near future, particularly the whole question of Iran, as well as the U.S.-Israel relationship and Gaza disengagement. There's no doubt that that's true, and I think that what those of us in the pro-Israel community are focused on is trying to assess how to make the neighborhood that Israel lives in safer, how to make the planet safer, how to make the United States safer in dealing with these issues. It's almost axiomatic that Israel lives in an extremely dangerous neighborhood. And an overarching question for the United States and for Israel is how to make that neighborhood safer, and now in the context of making that neighborhood safer, how to make the world safer. I think there is a consensus on both sides of the aisle and throughout the American political process. We can all agree we're engaged in a war on terror. And to me, the question isn't whether to fight the war on terror, but how best to fight and win the war on terror. And I think in terms of assessing where we go in the future and how we're going to deal with these specific issues, as Bill did, I think it's worth reviewing the past. Because what's happened in the past has a substantial relevance to what we can expect in the future. To me, one of the first things that I think that we need to be doing in fighting the war on terror is trying to remove ideology from the equation and relying more on experienced military judgments and facts on the ground. Dennis emphasized with regard to Iraq, which is the first subject that I want to talk about, that however we got there, whatever the choices, we have no choice but to win. That is absolutely right. John Kerry agrees with that, and I believe that whatever mistakes were made in the course of Iraq, if we do not win this war, the consequences that Dennis outlined will surely ensue. I think in terms of how we fight the war, we need to place rigorous analysis over ideological purity, reversing what a number of choices have been so far in conducting the war. And I want to take a moment just to read 2 paragraphs from a Tom Friedman op-ed of 3 weeks ago, which outlines better than I can some of the mistakes that were made that we need to avoid. And Tom, on October 3rd, said the following: "Here is the cold, hard truth. This war has been hugely mismanaged by this administration in the face of clear advice to the contrary at every stage, and as a result, the range of decent outcomes in Iraq has been narrowed, and the tools we have to bring even those about are more limited than ever. What happened? The Bush team got its doctrines mixed up. It applied the Powell doctrine to the campaign against John Kerry, overwhelming force without mercy, based on a strategy of shock and awe at the Republican convention, followed by a propaganda blitz that got its message across in every possible way, including through distortion. While the Bush people applied the Powell doctrine in the Midwest, they applied the Rumsfeld doctrine in the Middle East. And the Rumsfeld doctrine is just enough troops to lose. Donald Rumsfeld tried to prove that a small, mobile army was all that was needed to topple Saddam, without realizing that such a limited force could never stabilize Iraq. He thought it would have to. He never thought it would have to. He thought his Iraqi pals would do it. He was wrong. Each time the Bush team had to choose between doing the right thing in the war on terrorism or siding with its political base and ideology, it chose its base and ideology. More troops or radically lower taxes? Lower taxes. Fire an evangelical Christian U.S. general who smears Islam in a speech while wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army, or not fire him as not to anger the Christian right? Don't fire him. apologize to the UN for not finding the WMD, and then make the case for why our allies should still join us in Iraq to establish a decent government there. Don't apologize for anything because Karl Rove says the base won't like it. Impose a patriot tax of 50 cents a gallon on gasoline to help pay for the war, shrink the deficit, and reduce the amount of oil we consume so we send less money to Saudi Arabia? Never. Just tell the Americans to go on guzzling and reduce the amount to go on guzzling. Fire the Secretary of Defense for the abuses at Abu Ghraib to show the world how seriously we take this outrage, or do nothing. Do nothing. Firing Mr. Rumsfeld might upset conservatives. I do believe that one of the most important changes that need to be made in securing Iraq is listening to the military, removing ideology from the equation. While we have made these mistakes with regard to Iraq, we have emboldened Iran. Howard Corr outlined, and Dennis outlined, I think, very clearly the extremely difficult choices we have in Iran, where there's a real nuclear threat. This is something that we need to get into in the question and answer session and in the dialogue. But I can say that one of the tragedies of the mismanagement of Iraq is that the Iranians feel emboldened. They feel emboldened both in Iraq, where the Shiites now, according to the president, could end up winning a democratic election, which would be a disaster for the United States, and where Iran feels that the United States is now so bogged down that the threat of military action and the threat of doing what many of us would like to see done in Iraq just doesn't appear to be credible to the Iranians. Moving to the Israel-Palestinian situation, despite some quite grandiose rhetoric about this administration's support for Israel, which I believe is well-intentioned, and I applaud the rhetoric, unfortunately the failure to follow through, or to follow through well, is increasingly being seen as making Israel less safe rather than more safe. Let me just quote briefly from the highly respected Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University, which said last week that instead of striking a blow against Islamic extremists, the Iraq war, quote, has created momentum for many terrorist elements, but chiefly Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, end quote. On a strategic level as well as an operational level, the war in Iraq is hurting the war on international terrorism. One letter that I saw just yesterday that came from Israel last Wednesday, talking about the facts on the ground, concluded with the following. This is from an American who moved to Israel 27 years ago, who is the associate editor of the Jerusalem Report, Gershom Gorenberg, the author of The End of Days, Fundamentalism and the Struggle for the Temple Mount. Daily at my desk in Jerusalem, I read emails from old friends in America, each describing the aunt, neighbor, colleague who disliked George Bush's domestic record but plans to vote for him anyway because he is, quote, good for Israel. I wish I had time to write to each of these well-intentioned voters because their difficult choice is unnecessary. Bush's supposed support for Israel is an illusion. The real Bush record on Israel consists of missed chances and neglect. 4 more years of the same is unthinkable. There is nothing abstract about this for me. I moved from the United States to Israel 27 years ago. The past 4 have been the worst. I don't let my children ride buses. I choose cafes on the quality of the security check at the entrance. One distinct difference between a President Kerry and a President Bush, and one that has made the pro-Israel community nervous, is Senator Kerry's view that to win the war on terror, we need to engage other nations. Bill referred to this, and I've heard a number of people refer to this. There's a great fear that by engaging other nations, somehow the coin that will be traded by the American administration will be the coin of Israel. First of all, John Kerry has a 20-year record in the United States Senate that AIPAC itself has indicated has been right on every single issue that John Kerry has looked at. John Kerry, time and again, on every bill, every amendment, every letter, every initiative, that the pro-Israel community has reached out to him for his 20 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has been there. I actually was digressing a bit, thinking about my own experience. I mentioned this at a prior AIPAC event. When I was in Congress and I would rack up a 90 or a 95% record with a civil liberties group or an environmental group, they would say, gee, you're terrific. Our community is understandably even more demanding than that because Israel can't afford mistakes. Israel can't afford anybody who will say, well, let's have a second chance. Well, the truth is John Kerry, over 20 years, not just as a senator, but as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which sees many more of these issues than the entire body of the Senate, has racked up a record for 20 years of 100% support for Israel. He would continue that as president, and he would continue that in dealing with the international community. But if you neglect to deal with the international community, you leave the United States isolated, you leave Israel more isolated, and although you have the military option up to a point, you can't do the type of cracking down on money laundering and the financing of terrorists that you need. You need the help of others to do it. You can't get international help in intelligence cooperation or in law enforcement cooperation. And so John Kerry rightly says, in order to win the war on terror and to make both America and Israel safer, we need to restore America's standing, restore America's credibility.
We'll leave this discussion now on relations with Israel and U.S. policy in the Middle East. For more live coverage of the Association of U.S.